In the gritty streets of 1920 Chicago, where the sound of gunfire often punctuated the night air, one man stood out from the rest, not for his imposing stature or menacing demeanor, but for his seemingly incongruous passion for flowers. This is the story of Dean O'Banion, the mobster who could arrange a beautiful bouquet just as easily as he could arrange a gangland hit. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. November 10th, 2024 marks the 100th anniversary of one of Chicago's most notorious mob killings, and it happened across the street from one of this city's most celebrated churches. When most people think of the Chicago mob, the first name that comes to mind is Al Capone. But before there was Capone, there was O'Banion. Charles Dean O'Banion was born on July 8, 1892 in the small town of Maroa, Illinois, roughly 185 miles southwest of Chicago. His father, Charles Preston O'Banion from Kentucky, listed his occupation as barber in the 1900 census. After the death of his mother from tuberculosis, Charles O'Banion and his family moved to Chicago, settling in the Little Hell neighborhood near Division just east of the river. While young Dean O'Banion served as an altar boy at Holy Name Cathedral, even singing in the choir, the rough-and-tumble streets of Chicago began to call to Dean. After quitting school at age 14, he put his strong tenor voice to use as a singing waiter at McGovern's Bar, a North Clark Street dive where the rowdy lowlifes would often get out of line, and Dean, a tough brawler, would fill in as a bouncer. One of the crooks who patronized McGovern's introduced O'Banion to safecracking, which O'Banion took to with little prompting. He wasn't always great at it. Early on, he figured if a little nitroglycerin was good, even more would be great. This often resulted in him blowing up the safe and everything in it. O'Banion's advanced criminal career began when he joined the Market Street Gang, along with his friends Earl Jaime Weiss, Vincent the Schemer Drucy, and George Bugs Moran. O'Banion learned the ropes of Chicago's underworld. They started as sluggers, thugs hired by newspapers to intimidate newsstand owners during the newspaper circulation wars of the 1910s. It was a pretty straightforward gig. O'Banion and his pals would visit newsstands and tell the owners which newspaper to carry. If the owner attempted to carry another paper, O'Banion and his pals would give them a beatdown. It was a brutal introduction to the world of organized crime, a world to which O'Banion seemed well-suited. Prohibition was set to begin in January of 1920, and the rush was on by bars, restaurants, and everyday citizens to stockpile as much booze as possible. This gave crooks plenty of opportunities to make their play, often by robbing their rivals. One of the first hijackings to which O'Banion was connected occurred in December of 1919, followed by the Northside Gang making off with $100,000, more than $1.5 million today, worth of Canadian whiskey from a freight car sitting idle on the west side. At a large warehouse at 16th and Peoria Streets, O'Banion's crew carted off a fortune of Kentucky whiskey, allegedly while local cops on the Northside Gang's payroll kept an eye out for them, even escorting them as they drove away from the scene of the crime. Soon O'Banion was arranging shipments of beer, whiskey, and gin from Canada. The 1920 census shows Dean O'Banion living with his father, who had gotten remarried to an Irish woman named Margaret, at 822 West Oakdale Avenue, near the corner of Halston and Wellington in Lincoln Park. 27-year-old Dean listed his occupation as a newspaper reporter. In reality, he was on his way to becoming one of Chicago's top gangsters. While Dean O'Banion and his pals were distributing illegal liquor on Chicago's north side, Johnny Torrio, head of the predominantly Italian South Side mob, had a lock on that area. With the help of his lieutenant, Al Capone, Johnny Torrio arranged a meeting with the various bootleggers around the city, including Dean O'Banion, to carve up territories for distribution. The goal was to avoid bloody turf battles and to better wield their influence around town. O'Banion's North Side crew would continue handling that area, including the lucrative Gold Coast. Torrio's Southside mob would cover that part of Chicago, and the Jenna brothers would sell to Little Italy on Chicago's west side. What set O'Banion apart from his contemporaries was his unique blend of ruthlessness and refinement. He was known for his impeccable dress sense, always sporting a suit and tie. It was O'Banion who popularized this dapper look among gangsters, trying to elevate their image from street thugs to sophisticated businessmen. Dean O'Banion's fashionable suits were custom-tailored with 3 spacious and easily accessible pockets in which O'Banion carried 3 revolvers with one within reach at all times. One of the most intriguing aspects of Dean O'Banion's character was his genuine love for flowers. In 1921, he bought an interest in William Schofield's flower shop at 738 North State Street, located across the street from Holy Name Cathedral, where O'Banion served as an altar boy and sang in the choir in his youth. Why a flower shop, you might be thinking? Well, the constant flow of deliveries provided cover for bootlegging operations, and the shop's proximity to Holy Name Cathedral made it an ideal meeting place for gangsters who could claim they were simply there attending Mass. Moreover, O'Banion used his flower business to profit from the very violence he helped perpetrate. Whenever a gangland figure was killed, it was customary for both allies and rivals to send elaborate floral tributes. O'Banion, as the florist of choice for the underworld, made a tidy profit from these bouquets. Now, this wasn't just a front for his criminal activities and a way to launder money. O'Banion truly enjoyed working with flowers and was known to be an excellent arranger. In addition to his criminal activities and his floral shop front, Dean O'Banion found love, marrying Viola Caniff in February of 1921. The couple settled into an apartment at 3600 North Pine Grove, roughly half a mile from Wrigley Field. As O'Banion's power grew, he established the North Side Gang, which quickly became a force to be reckoned with in Chicago's underworld. Soon O'Banion's crew was pulling in $1 million a year, roughly $17.5 million in today's value, from their bootlegging enterprise. A few things you should know about Dean O'Banion before the story continues. He didn't drink. To him, alcohol was a commodity, merely a way to make money. He was extremely generous with friends and was known for aiding the poor. And as a devout Catholic, he would not abide by one of the mob's most lucrative rackets, prostitution. "I don't peddle flesh," O'Banion said, "and I never will." The first 3 years of the arrangement between O'Banion, Johnny Torrio, and the Jenna brothers started off with promise, but soon began to devolve. The Jenna brothers began encroaching into O'Banion's territory, peddling substandard whiskey. When O'Banion complained to Johnny Torrio, Torrio did little to smooth things over. O'Banion responded by hijacking some of the Jenna brothers' booze shipments. The Jenna brothers planned to get revenge against O'Banion by killing him, but O'Banion had a guardian angel, Mike Merlo, the head of the local Sicilian Union, who did business with O'Banion. As long as Mike Merlo had his back, Dean O'Banion was not to be harmed. One event that would ultimately seal O'Banion's fate was a clever but dangerous double-cross known as the Zeben Brewery incident. In May of 1924, O'Banion learned that the police were planning to raid the Zeben Brewery, in which both he and Johnny Torrio held large stakes. Seeing an opportunity, O'Banion approached Torrio and offered to sell his share in the brewery, claiming he wanted to leave the bootlegging business. Torrio, unaware of the impending raid, agreed and paid O'Banion $500,000, more than $9 million today, for his share. The very night of O'Banion's last shipment, the police raided the brewery. O'Banion, having no previous Prohibition-related arrests, was soon released from custody. Torrio, on the other hand, was arrested along with several associates and faced potential jail time. The betrayal was the last straw for Torrio and Capone. O'Banion had not only cheated them out of a large sum of money, but had also humiliated them in front of the entire Chicago underworld. O'Banion's final mistake came when he insulted Angelo Genna, one of the Genna brothers. O'Banion had discovered Angelo Genna had racked up a large debt at a mob-owned casino. Johnny Torrio's lieutenant, Al Capone, suggested O'Banion forgive the debt as a professional courtesy, but O'Banion wasn't having it. In a heated phone call made on November 3, 1924, O'Banion demanded that Genna pay the large gambling debt within a week. Incensed by this insult, Angelo Genna and the Genna brothers wanted to take action against O'Banion, but were again held back by Mike Merlo, head of the Sicilian Union. As long as Merlo was around, O'Banion couldn't be touched. 6 days later, on November 9, 1924, Mike Merlo succumbed to cancer at his home at 443 West Diversey. O'Banion had lost his protector. On the morning of November 10th, 1924, Dean O'Banion had breakfast with his wife and, after kissing her goodbye, headed to the florist shop in his luxury Locomobile, one of a half-dozen cars the couple had, a collection worth $40,000 then, roughly $700,000 in today's value. After arriving at the shop, he got to work trimming chrysanthemums. It was going to be a busy day for O'Banion and his staff. Not only were there the usual floral arrangements to prepare, there were also plenty of orders that needed to be readied for the funeral of Mike Merlo. $25,000 worth of orders had come in for the Merlo funeral already, and more were expected. That week would also have Chicagoans recognizing Armistice Day, later renamed Veterans Day, also a big day for the shop. While working on arrangements, Dean O'Banion received a phone call to let him know 3 men would be in that day to pick up an order for Mike Merlo's funeral. Around noon, 3 men entered the shop. O'Banion, who had been working in the back room alongside a porter named William Crutchfield, stepped out to greet them. Crutchfield would later tell police that before returning to the back room, he glanced at the trio, claiming the man in the middle of the 3 was, quote, tall, well-built, well-dressed, smooth-shaven, wore a brown overcoat and a brown fedora hat, and may have been Greek or Jewish. The other 2, said Crutchfield, may have been Italians, describing them as, quote, short, stocky, and rather rough-looking. Still holding his trimming shears in one hand, O'Banion said, hello, boys. You from Mike Merlo's? The tall, well-dressed man replied, yes, and leaned in for a handshake. O'Banion outstretched his free hand toward the tall man. As the 2 men connected, the tall man pulled O'Banion off balance as the other men drew pistols and began to fire. With one hand locked in the handshake and his other hand still holding the shears, O'Banion had no chance to reach for one of his pistols. As the pop, pop, pop of the sound of the gunfire filled the air, every bullet hit its mark. 2 entered through the right side of O'Banion's chest, 2 pierced his throat, the 5th through his right cheek, and after a momentary pause, a 6th bullet entered O'Banion's left cheek. Investigators deduced the final shot occurred after O'Banion had fallen. The left cheek is badly powder burned, they explained. It's likely one of the killers bent over the body after it had fallen and fired that shot at very close range to make the job sure. Those people take no chances. 32-year-old Dean O'Banion had taken his last breath surrounded by the flowers he loved so much. The porter, William Crutchfield, stepped out into the front of the shop to see the three men exit the front door and get into a dark-colored, nickel-trimmed Jewett auto with its engine running. Behind the wheel was a getaway driver who quickly sped off down Superior Street. Two sign painters working on a building a door away claimed they hadn't heard a thing and continued painting. Police arrived at the scene. Captain Shoemaker of the Detective Bureau, Chief of Detectives Michael Hughes, Captain Daniel McCarthy, two assistant state's attorneys, and dozens of detectives all made their way into the florist shop. O'Banion's body was brought to the rear of the shop, his white shirt now stained blood red, his once handsome face now corrupted by bullets and powder burns. An old piece of canvas was used to cover his corpse. Before the three men had entered the shop and opened fire, Dean O'Banion had asked his assistant, William Crutchfield, to sweep up the little leaves and fallen petals at the front of the shop. An hour later, with the permission of the coroner, Crutchfield took to mopping up the blood of his fallen boss. Several suspects were brought in for questioning, including Johnny Torrio and Al Capone. What one reporter described as, quote, the inevitable Italian wall of silence descended quickly, giving police little with which to work. One gangster, a friend and fellow criminal associate of O'Banion's named Louis Altieri, shared this with the police, widely printed in newspapers. I have no idea who killed O'Banion, but I would be willing to die smiling if I only had the chance to meet the guys who did. Anytime, any place they mention, and I would get at least 2 or 3 of them before they'd get me. I want to shoot it out with them at the corner of State and Madison Streets. Days later, the November 14th Chicago Daily Tribune headline read, Rid City of Gunmen, Deaver. Chicago Mayor William Deaver, known as Decent Deaver, had been elected in 1923 as a reformist. Challenged by the crimes and boasts of gunmen in Chicago, Mayor Deaver announced law and order must prevail in Chicago and that gangsters would be disarmed and jailed or driven out of town. Every one of the city's 5,000 policemen would be counted on to maintain order, as would municipal and state judges. A shoot-to-kill order was issued to police for any known gangster who tried to resist arrest or questioning. The situation is becoming intolerable, Mayor Deaver declared. It is time to decide which element in Chicago is going to control. It should be determined whether organized outlaws shall continue to shoot and rob with impunity, or whether decency and order will prevail. There can be no question as to the outcome in favor of law and its strict enforcement. Deaver seemed most agitated by Louis Altieri's pronouncement about wanting a shootout in the Loop. One day we have the alleged king of our underworld shot down in daylight in his place of business as the result of a deliberate and minutely organized assassin's plot, said Mayor Deaver. And the next day we have the Chief Man Friday of the king, this Louis Altieri, openly boasting of the nimbleness of his trigger finger and the number of guns he's carrying, and daring the slayers of his chief to do battle with him in the public streets. You'd think such fellows have totally forgotten there is such a thing as a police force in Chicago, maintained by the people for the purpose of running down and punishing the guilty. They appear to think they alone are the executors of the law, that when one of their number is slain, the proper thing to do is stalk somebody else and shoot him down likewise, in defiance of law, order, and society. The question is, are we abiding by the code of the Dark Ages, or is Chicago a unit of an American Commonwealth? Deaver would only serve one term, ousted by those fed up with Prohibition. Replacing him was Big Bill Thompson, one of the most corrupt mayors in Chicago history. A few doors down the street from the William Schofield florist shop was Sabarbaro's undertaking, which handled many funerals for prominent Chicagoans, including those connected to gangs. Sabarbaro would handle Dean O'Banion's funeral. Dean O'Banion's body was available for viewing for 3 days, and during that time, an estimated 40,000 visitors filed through, some to pay their respects, others to gawk, all passing the 26 carloads of flowers on display in the funeral home. Most striking of the floral arrangements was a heart of 2,000 American beauty buds standing 8 feet high, bearing the word husband. The Teamsters Union sent a large wreath, and a basket of roses included a card from Al Brown, one of Al Capone's aliases. 30 men worked to create a blanket of roses, orchids, and lilies 10 feet by 7 feet, intended to cover O'Banion's grave. The invoice for the funeral from Sabarbaro totaled nearly $10,000, with $7,500, nearly $140,000 today, just for the casket. The cost of flowers, estimated to be $50,000, is not listed. Holy Name Cathedral, the same church in which Dean O'Banion was an altar boy and sang in the choir, refused him the ritual for the dead, explaining, quote, "A person who refused the ministrations of the church in life need not expect to have ministrations of the church in death." As he had never been convicted of murder and did not die of suicide, O'Banion would be allowed to be buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, but the burial would be in unconsecrated ground in that part, quote, "set aside for those of mixed marriages and the like," end quote, according to the superintendent of Mount Carmel Cemetery. On Friday, November 14th, 1924, 200 Chicago policemen tried in vain to maintain order in the 700 block of North State Street. So thick was the crowd of roughly 20,000 in front of Sabarbaro's funeral home that 50 policemen on horseback and motorcycles were brought in to clear a path. Police were under orders to search spectators and disarm gunmen, but no guns were found. In addition to the thousands of onlookers in the streets, pictures in that day's Chicago Tribune show crowds in the hundreds watching from nearby rooftops. Ironically, among the mourners were Al Capone and other members of the Southside Gang, paying their respects to a fallen rival even as they celebrated their victory over O'Banion. Dean O'Banion's widow, Viola, and his father, Charles, were consoled by Father Patrick Malloy of St. Thomas of Canterbury Church. Once the funeral cortege was underway, it was led by motorcycle policemen from Stickney, Illinois, a village roughly 12 miles southwest of downtown Chicago. Chicago Chief of Police Morgan A. Collins had refused to have Chicago cops be part of the spectacle and only had officers there to prevent disorder and to watch for a flare-up of the feud that might endanger citizens. In addition to those crowded in front of the funeral home, another 150,000 people looked on as the long procession headed down Wells Street, Jackson Boulevard, and Roosevelt Road on its way to Mount Carmel Cemetery, where Dean O'Banion would be laid to rest. The superintendent of the Mount Carmel Cemetery later claimed that 500 autos were lined up at the cemetery as early as 10 a.m., and the electric car line that came to the cemetery was packed as well. The superintendent estimated 5,000 people were waiting at the cemetery before the body had even left Chicago. O'Banion's crew did not allow photographs to be taken at the gravesite. Cameras were wrestled away from photographers, photo plates were smashed, and a few fists were thrown. Father Malloy was at the gravesite as well, but not in any official capacity. He did not sprinkle the casket with holy water, as is the custom. He did recite a litany or two in Latin, then the Lord's Prayer in English, then 3 Hail Marys. Dean O'Banion King of the hijackers, bootleggers, safecrackers, one of Chicago's first mob heavyweights, who police suspected was responsible for 25 murders, was dead and buried. Within days of O'Banion's killing, authorities and academics stepped forward to discuss Chicago's violence problem. The November 15, 1924 Chicago Daily Tribune ran with a headline that read, "Bears Chicago Gang Life." The accompanying article highlights Professor Frederick M. Thrasher of the University of Chicago's Department of Social Science, who reported on 1,313 of the city's clubs and gangs. According to the piece, Thrasher had become acquainted with the gang life while interviewing many of the gangsters and even living with a few. In 2 of those instances, he had to discontinue his investigation due to threats. The geographical location of the gang centers in the poverty belt that surrounds the Loop, Professor Thrasher stated, it is divided into the North Side jungles, the West Side wilderness, and the South Side badlands. Thrasher went on to say, politicians, realizing the power of these gangs, have tried to ingratiate themselves with them. Even aldermen establish connections with them and get jobs for the gang members in return for votes. 5 months after Dean O'Banion was buried, Viola O'Banion had him disinterred and reburied in consecrated ground. A large obelisk stands near his grave. According to author John J. Binder in his 2017 book, Al Capone's Beer Wars, A Complete History of Organized Crime in Chicago During Prohibition, Dean O'Banion's killers are reputed to have been Frankie Yale, John Scalise, and Albert Anselmi, acting on Johnny Torrio's behalf. O'Banion's death marked the beginning of what was called the Beer Wars, one of the bloodiest eras in Chicago's gang history. After O'Banion's death, the Northside Gang, now led by Earl Jaime Weiss, sought revenge against Johnny Torrio's Southside organization. In January of 1925, Weiss's crew attempted to assassinate Torrio, leaving him seriously wounded. After the attempt on his life, Johnny Torrio retired from his illegal activities in Chicago, handing the reins of the organization, now called the Chicago Outfit, to Al Capone, then just 26 years old. Torrio moved to Italy for a few years, then returned to the States, settling in New York. Torrio died of a heart attack at the age of 75. Chicago's mob violence escalated over the next few years, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Jaime Weiss was gunned down in 1926, and control of the Northside Gang shifted to George Bugs Moran. The conflict between the rival factions culminated in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, where 7 members of the Northside Gang were killed on the orders of Al Capone. Louis Altieri, O'Banion's right-hand man, left Chicago and bought a ranch in Colorado. After an altercation that left 1 man dead, Altieri returned to Chicago and resumed his criminal ways. He was gunned down outside his apartment at 922 West Eastwood Avenue in July of 1935. He was 48 years old. The 1930 census shows Dean O'Banion's wife, Viola, living at 1544 West Thorndale with 2 daughters. Viola, then 3.5, and Patricia, 3 months. There is no father listed on the record at the household, but they did have an 18-year-old Swedish-born servant named Astrid Johnson living with them. According to records, Viola remarried at least 3 times before passing away in June of 1976 at the age of 75. William Schofield continued running his florist shop, eventually moving operations to a storefront at 731 North Dearborn Street. When he died in 1947 at the age of 68, his obituary mentioned his connection to Dean O'Banion more than 23 years after O'Banion's death. The building that once housed Schofield's Flower Shop at 738 North State Street was torn down on August 13, 1960, and the site later became a parking lot for Holy Name Cathedral for many years. In 2017, it was announced that a new mixed-use project would be erected on that site. At 2.1 million square feet, One Chicago is a combination of 55,000 square feet of office space, 812 residential units, restaurant and banquet space with retail offerings at its base. McGovern's Saloon, where Dean O'Banion was a singing waiter and plotted to rip off drunk patrons, became the Liberty Inn, one of Chicago's largest strip clubs in the 1950s. In early 1972, that location became PQ's, considered the first live DJ gay disco in Chicago, followed a year later by a bar called Ms., then Saturday's Girl, before becoming a punk club called O'Banion's in June of 1978, named for Dean O'Banion. That lasted 4 years. The building at 661 North Clark in the River North neighborhood now houses the Carryman, calling itself Chicago's liveliest Irish bar. Dean O'Banion is buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, in Section L, Block 1, Lot S7. Hopefully you enjoyed today's Chicago Mob Stories episode about Dean O'Banion. As always, if you have any questions about anything covered today, anything to add, or have an idea for a future episode, I'd love to hear about it. Send me an email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. I have links to various books and movies about this subject. If you'd like to learn more, anything ordered through those links, not just the items listed, may earn a small commission for the podcast and help offset production costs at no cost to you. Check out the Chicago History Podcast social media pages for articles and pictures related to this episode and past episodes posted throughout the week. The original art for the Chicago History Podcast used on these social media pages was created by John K. Schneider. Outstanding as always, Johnny. Send him an email at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. I will be back soon with more stories from Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.